Welcome to the latest addition to the Compliance Podcast Network, the podcast 10 for 10, which brings you the week's top 10 compliance stories curated together in one podcast each week. Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, brings you the compliance professional stories you need to be aware of at the end of your busy week. Sit back and in 10 minutes, hear about the stories every compliance professional should be aware of. Every Saturday, 10 for 10 highlights the most important news, insights, and analysis for the compliance professional, all curated by the voice of compliance, Tom Fox. Get your weekly filling of compliance stories with 10 for 10. Hosted by Tom Fox. 10 for 10 is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. Top 10 compliance stories for the week ending December 9, 2023. First up, the first of two stories from the Wall Street Journal. This one from the CFO Journal, Mark Maurer reporting on an article of what the SEC's chief accountant wants from companies. It includes risk assessment of risk by auditors of a firm, accounting firm culture, and the importance of cash flow statements. Paul Munter said firms need to commit to their auditor independence and place the public interest at the center of their operations, rather than making the audit practice solely responsible for its quality. The culture of the firm has to be one which cascades throughout the firm. Given the corruption and other nefarious acts we've seen of some of the accounting firms, it's going to be hard to get there. Next up, also from the CFO Journal, this time an article from Jennifer Williams-Alvarez, takes a look at AI's unusual board structure. Should it change to govern it effectively? If you don't know, the OpenAI board structure has a nonprofit which owns the profit-making company. And this seems to be a problem for many people. And one popular fix suggested is to dissolve the nonprofit and say, sort through the potential conflicts of interest that might erupt. One commentator said simply that profits and nonprofits don't mix because they have entirely different goals. I'm not one of those, and I think good corporate governance can be simply good corporate governance, but apparently some people don't think so. Next up from the Brookings Institute, how anti-corruption efforts strengthen global democracy and security. For those who have always thought that anti-corruption compliance programs really strengthen democracy, now we have this from Brookings. And the converse, of course, is corrupt regimes around the world threaten global democracy and security. Brookings has a new project entitled the Global Anti-Corruption Democracy and Security Project, and its head, Norman Eisen, explains why fighting corruption and promoting good governance are a key to strengthening democracy and certainly in the national security interests of the United States. Next up, one of my favorite articles from the past week was from The Guardian, which looked at the movie Serpico at 50 years since its release. It was a great movie. The book was equally great. We have, of course, had Al Pacino starring as Frank Serpico. We had directed by Sidney Lumet. And it was a really gritty, down and dirty look at New York City in the early to mid 70s, the corruption epidemic in the New York Police Department, and how one lone whistleblower tried to help fight it and nearly lost his life for it. Next up from the Salt Lake Tribune, not an often contributor to either the Daily Compliance News or 10 for 10, but they have a story from 25 years ago about how Salt Lake City's bribery scandal rocked the Olympic movement. Utah bid organizers literally were paid bribes in the case, and bribes were paid by Utah to get Salt Lake City selected as the host city. This led to a host of reforms in the Olympic movement and really shed a light on corruption in non-governmental entities. Next up, the third of four articles from the Wall Street Journal, this time from the Risk and Compliance Journal. Mingyi Sun reporting that the Securities and Exchange Commission is taking a deeper dive into non-disclosure agreements, which allege to prevent people from fulfilling legal obligations to report all types of nefarious corporate activity. And they are imposing stiff fines and indeed fined D.E. Shaw $10 million for having pre-taliation or essentially NDAs, which allege to prevent the fulfillment of obligations as noted. Second story from the Risk and Compliance Journal, also the Wall Street Journal, from David Smagala, reports that Mallinckrodt has avoided a $40 million fine in a Medicaid overcharge case because of its superior response in committing and upgrading its compliance program, committing to retain a compliance consultant, or as the rest of the world calls it, monitors, and the financial position of the company. Of course, it's in bankruptcy, trying to get out of the mess it put itself in by these fraudulent reportings. So, there you go. Next up, in an article that ties into the Brookings report, this time from The Atlantic, it says, if Trump has a second term, expect endemic corruption in the United States. And the playbook will be, of course, his first term. And what were his playbook? Well, to have foreign investors, foreign companies, or anyone who wants Trump's ear, rent, buy, or pay to use his properties. He was well known for the number of people who stayed at the Trump Hotel in Washington. It turns out that the Chinese government and the Russian government both had floors in Trump Tower. So he's got this playbook of corruption. And indeed, when anyone travels, they have to, outside the United States, they have to stay at a Trump-approved resort. And what does that mean? Well, it means money goes to Trump. So that's just what he's played with in his first term. And given that he's already said he's going to institute a dictatorship on day one, we can only wait to see what he does, particularly around gutting anti-corruption laws going forward. Next up, the China's from the South China Morning Post, as China's top corruption buster warns of a risk of rebounds in cases. This is because of a couple of different reasons. One, corruption in China is becoming harder to detect. For instance, extravagant spending, and particularly during the holiday season, the Chinese Anti-Corruption Agency is going to look at what is spent for holiday meals or other entertainment during this season, even leading up to the Chinese New Year. So the Chinese anti-corruption effort will continue, and the 8 directives of anti-corruption will continue to be part of the fight against what the Chinese call 4 forms of decadence, which have become hidden or transformed, so that there needs to be precise supervision around these issues of Chinese governmental leaders. And finally, if you don't think anti-corruption is good for your health, take a look at this story, also from The Guardian, from Torsten Bell, who reports that fat cats in China's waistlines are actually getting smaller, and they're becoming healthier because they are not spending money on lavish gifts, entertainment, and meals. So you never really probably considered anti-corruption from the health aspect, but here in China, it appears that government fat cats are slimming down because they're not engaging in so many lavish meals or corruption. Thanks for listening to this episode of 10 for 10. As I mentioned in a prior episode, this is the one request I've received most often from podcast listeners of the Daily Compliance News to put together a summary at week's end so that every compliance professional can catch up on the news quite quickly. So I hope you will subscribe, rate, and review to this new podcast addition to the Compliance Podcast Network family, 10 for 10. If you've got an idea for a podcast, I'd love to hear from you. I start many shows based upon ideas from listeners. So give me a shout. You can reach me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. 10 for 10 is a proud member of the Compliance Podcast Network.